This video is for Chapter 4 for AP Environmental Science. Chapter 4 has to do with biodiversity and evolution. So the first core case study that starts at the beginning is talking about amphibians. Why are amphibians vanishing? Looking at them as a really good example of biodiversity and the relationship between biodiversity and the ecosystem services that can be provided by having a rich amount of biodiversity. So make sure you go over this. Make sure you understand what are some of the reasons many amphibian species are declining. Remember, part of that has to do with the fact that amphibians are, they spend half their life cycle in the water and they spend the other half out of the water. And so they are very sensitive to changes in the environment, especially when it comes to water pollution. And also amphibians were able to, or historically within their evolutionary past, were able to survive environmental changes really well and very effectively compared to other species because of their fast breeding time and the large quantities that they reproduce at one time. But that's changing. So make sure you go over this and look at some of the reasons behind that. All right, so going into Chapter 4 itself, the first section is looking at what exactly is biodiversity. Remember, biodiversity is looking at the diversity of species on the earth. So how many different types of living things do we have? How many different genes are contained? How many different types of ecosystems are there? So there are about 4 different types of biodiversity that we look at. So there's functional diversity, which has to do with just processes. But the 3 important ones that you need to know, especially for the AP exam, of course, are going to be ecological diversity. So looking at the variations and the variety of different ecosystems and habitats. So that you're talking about basically habitat, places around the world. And then you've got species diversity, which is the characteristic that we normally think of when we talk about biodiversity. The many different types of living organisms that exist on the planet. And then of course there's genetic diversity, which is really important as far as evolution, because again, you've got populations sharing common gene pools, and as those gene pools change over time due to mutations that occur in reproductive cells and they're passed on from parent to offspring, those changes start to accumulate and you start to have more variety, and sometimes eventually you can have a new species form. So make sure that you understand the concept that the more genetically diverse a population is, the better it can respond to environmental changes. And remember also that it's a misconception that organisms don't change in response to the environment. It's the characteristics that are already present because of their DNA that they already have that allows them to have certain characteristics that are more suitable for that new environment or those changes that have happened in the environment. Those are the ones that are able to survive and reproduce. So remember, it's not that an organism can will their DNA to change or will themselves to change. It has to do with stuff that already exists that's there. All right, so going on to the next page, again, make sure that you just go over the 4 different types and make sure you're familiar with them. The Science and Focus page is talking about insects, the role and the ecosystem services that they provide, so make sure you look at them. So what are some of the characteristics that help to contribute to their resiliency? Why are they so successful at survival? Why are they so successful when it comes to resistance, meaning resistance to things like pesticides? So make sure you pay attention to that. All right, so this one again is just kind of going over, this page is going over looking at the differences in types of ecosystems, for example. So this is all along the 39th parallel, and the fact that not everything looks the same, even though it's all receiving the same amount of sunlight. Because you have contours on the land surface, you've got differences that are happening. And we'll talk more about the climate and how the mountains can play an effect and things like that as far as precipitation. And we'll talk about biomes in Chapter 7. But for here, just know that when we talk about ecosystem diversity, we're talking about the fact that you have all of these different types of places. And this is just an example. There's more examples or there are more types of ecosystems out there besides just this. All right. Section 2 is going into evolution, and hopefully you remember some of this from bio, because this is not something that we get to spend a lot of time on. But make sure that you understand and you know what a fossil is, how fossils form. You understand that fossils are the preserved remains of organisms that lived millions or hundreds of millions of years ago, and that it takes very, very special circumstances for fossils to form. And so that's why we consider the fossil record to be incomplete, because we know that it was the random chance that these particular organisms happen to be they died in the right place at the right time, and circumstances just all lined up perfectly in order to preserve their remains. So we know there's a lot of organisms that existed on the planet within Earth's history that there is no record of them. Make sure you understand the concept of evolution. And evolution is talking about the change in life over time. And that is through changes in populations, or in the gene pools of populations, in succeeding generations. So those changes start to accumulate. And like I said, either we start to see new characteristics, or what we call adaptations, or sometimes eventually we have a new species form. And then natural selection, make sure that you understand that natural selection is looking at individuals with certain traits that are more successful for particular environments are more likely going to be able to survive and reproduce. So if they can survive, that means they can reproduce. And if it's those traits that they already had that was allowing them to be successful at survival, then they're probably they're more likely going to pass those traits on to their offspring. And so that kind of continues and perpetuates that. So make sure you're going over that. All right. When we talk about mutations, remember that mutations are changes that happen in DNA and RNA. Mutations can be very small, simple base mutations, swapping out, like, say, an A for a G on accident. Sometimes they can be entire sections of chromosomes. So there are different types, and again, that's a review from bio. But remember that for a mutation to have an impact on future generations, it has to happen in reproductive cells. So those sperm cells or egg cells, or if it's a plant, a pollen cell, that combines to form the offspring of the next generation, that's when the mutation is going to show up. Make sure that you understand an adaptation. So it's a trait, or any trait that, or sometimes it's a behavior that gives an organism the ability to be successful in its environment. And again, it's going to be very, very dependent on that particular environment, and your book goes over some examples. The other thing with mutation, and you can see here in this picture right here, make sure you understand how mutation and evolution go along with pesticide resistance. So, because we'll talk about it again when we get to agriculture, but remember, when you have, say, in this picture it shows bacteria, certain types of bacteria are resistant to certain chemicals, and they just happen to have those genes that allow them to resist those chemicals. Well, when you expose them to those chemicals, then what happens is it kills off all the ones that are not resistant to it. It allows the other ones to survive, and then eventually, because there's less competition within that population, more resources, then the ones that are able, or that have the resistant gene, are able to survive and reproduce more, and then eventually the makeup or genetic makeup of the population shifts. And that's something that we're seeing with antibiotic resistance, whether you're talking about antibiotics that you take when you get a prescription from the doctor, or the antibiotics that are used in cows and pigs and chicken and fish, farm-raised fish, to help prevent and treat disease because of how they're raised in close quarters. And so because those animals are ingesting those antibiotics, it's in their muscle mass, you're eating that meat, so you are actually being exposed to those antibiotics as well. And so that's why we're starting to see some types of bacteria that are resistant to a lot of the antibiotics that we use. All right, understand or know, remember that organisms are adapting to their environment over time, and it happens in short and long-term scales, and it's small incremental changes that are happening at the genetic level. And remember, when we talk about evolution, it's not an individual organism that evolves. It's evolution happens at the smallest level, is the level of the population, and we're talking about the gene pool. Make sure that you go through and you're familiar with the adaptations on natural selection. And then, of course, your book is really good as far as it talks about the misconceptions of evolution, and it tries to go back and clarify those. So make sure that you understand that. Don't focus on the misconception, focus on why. So the misconception, why? What's the correct version of that misconception?